Hello and welcome back to Rev Real Estate School. I'm your host, Michael Montgomery, and today we have a very exciting topic. We're talking about how you can predict the real estate market in 6 months' time. So this is a topic of conversation that is always interesting to consumers and agents alike, but especially right now when there's a lot of moving parts in our markets and there's a lot of discussion around markets changing. So how can we go about actually predicting what's going to happen in 6 months' time? Well, that's what we're going to discuss today. And we also have a free tool for you. So down in the show notes below, you will see access to a free tool. And we'll go through how to use this tool, but it's very straightforward. Basically, we put in a few numbers and then it's going to forecast out what the next 6 months will look like. So we are going to get into this towards the end of this discussion. So first off, when we are talking about predicting a real estate market, we need to understand something that is extremely important. We need to understand the nature of probability. And we also need to be communicating, if we're in real estate and we're talking with customers, we also need to be communicating in terms of probabilities. So what exactly does this look like? Well, as a real estate agent, you shouldn't really be going to a seller and saying your home is going to sell for $550, because that's speaking in absolutes and we truly don't know. We can look at evidence to help us understand the probability of it selling for $550, but we can't say with 100% certainty if it will sell for that number. And so naturally, we need to understand probabilities. And so when we're thinking about the future of the market and predicting the market, we need to understand that nothing here is absolute. And so when we're thinking about communication around this, we can use such words as the market is suggesting, or a likely outcome is this. And even thinking that way can be very helpful, because even when we forecast out, and if you were to use this tool to help forecast out your market, that's not definitively saying that this is what the market will do in 6 months' time. Instead, it's using historical data to help inform what we could see in 6 months' time, or what is a likely outcome. Now, if I was to tell you that currently, there are 3 months of inventory in your city. Is that good or is that bad? Well, a lot of things can depend here, but really, we don't know much about that until we look at previous months. Or if I was to say the average price in your community right now is $600,000, okay, but what was it the year previous? And this is where trends are very important. And when we're thinking about forecasting, we can't necessarily do that without understanding trends. And without having understanding of how trends and historical trends are what are going to inform our forecast as to what the market will look like in 6 months' time. So keep that in mind, that we can't necessarily communicate not only to ourselves, but to others, that this is what a market is doing, because we also need to look at trends and where things are trending. And that is going to help us predict what the future could look like. So if we come back to our example and we say that there is 3 months of inventory currently in your market, but last month, there was 0.5 months of inventory. Well, now this tells a whole different story, because 3 months of inventory, theoretically, would be considered a seller's market. And of course, so would 0.5. But there is a trend occurring here. If we're going from 0.5 to 3, we're seeing a pretty significant rise in months of inventory, which is suggesting something. So based on that historical trend, it's suggesting that the market may be slowing down. And that's the way that we need to be thinking when we're predicting the future real estate market. So with that, let's get out our crystal ball and let's start to understand how we're going to look at what the future is going to look like. So the statistic that we're going to focus on, or the metric, is months of inventory. And if you haven't heard of months of inventory before, basically what we're looking at is the number of active listings in a market divided by the number of listings that sold in that month. And so from here, we can see if there's no new inventory coming in, and if inventory is sold at the same pace that it was that month, how many months is it going to take to eat up the remaining inventory? Now, this is much easier to understand by way of an example. So if we have 5 active listings on the market and 1 listing sold in a given month, so we're taking 5 divided by 1, then we have 5 months of inventory. Because theoretically, if no new listings came on and we had 1 sale month over month, it would take 5 months to eat up that given inventory. Now, why is this so powerful? It's so powerful because we are looking at both supply and demand. When we look at number of sales, we just purely look at demand without looking at supply. When we look at number of new listings, we look at supply without looking at demand. And so what months of inventory really allows us to do is it allows us to understand how these two are working together. So let's think about this a little bit deeper. Let's say, so we had our 5 listings and we had 1 that sold. Let's say that over time, the number of listings was increasing. So the next month we had 10 and we still had 1 sale. Well, now our months of inventory is going to increase. And when our months of inventory goes up, that is pushing the market more in favor of the buyer. And when our months of inventory goes down, it's pushing the market more in favor of the seller. So you can also appreciate if we had those 5 listings and then the next month we had 2 listings only and 1 sale, well, now we have 2 months of inventory. So now we're trending down, which means we're moving more in favor of the seller. So thinking about this another way, the number on top is really our supply. That's their supply, and the number at the bottom is more of our demand. And if our supply goes up with our demand staying the same, we're going to move in favor of the buyer because months of inventory will go up. However, if our supply stays the same and our sales go up, so our demand goes up, our months of inventory is going to come down. And now that's going to start favoring the seller more. So with all of that in mind, how does this actually work? Well, a lot of times the way that we think of months of inventory determines what type of market we're in. So if we have less than 4 months of inventory, traditionally, that's thought of as a seller's market. And if we have 4 to 6 months of inventory, that's thought of as a balanced market. And then over 6 months of inventory, we start to move into a buyer's market. Now, keep in mind that every single community and every city and every property type will have its nuances. And we could start to feel more like a seller's market when it's closer to 3, or it may start to feel like more of a buyer's market when we're closer to 7. But generally speaking, those numbers tend to really showcase where we're sitting as far as the market conditions are concerned. But there's an important point here, and something that we've already been discussing is the nature of looking into the future 6 months. And we need to think about this. So there's a lot that can happen in a 6-month period of time. So if we start to forecast beyond 6 months using this methodology, then we could be at risk of providing a number or suggesting a certain market condition that isn't exactly true. And that's because there's so many things that can happen over the course of those 6 months. So really, we need to understand that we can predict with some degree of confidence within about a 6-month period of time, but beyond 6 months, it becomes very challenging to predict. Now, we can use the methodology that we're going to discuss here in order to predict, but that being said, our confidence starts to drop off dramatically after 6 months just because of so many different inputs to a real estate market. So now on to predicting your real estate market. So all you need to do in order to predict your real estate market using months of inventory, and yes, I understand that there's a lot of different variables that could go into predicting a real estate market, and months of inventory is just one piece of the pie, but it tends to be a fairly strong one. If we're looking at one metric, months of inventory is a very strong one to look at. And what we're going to do is we're going to input our starting month, and then we're going to put in 6 months of inventory. So what was the months of inventory in month 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6? And then typically month 6 is the last month. And then from month 6 to 12, we're going to predict. And the way that the prediction mechanism works is it just simply extrapolates the trend. So we're going to look at the trend over the last 6 months and what's been happening to months of inventory. And then we're going to basically take that trend line and just extend it. We're going to extrapolate it. And then we're going to look at 6 months' time. If we continue on this trend, what is that going to suggest as far as where we're going to be in 6 months' time? And again, we're using months of inventory because it is looking at that relationship between supply and demand. So if you do end up using this tool, basically all you're going to do is you're going to put in your starting month. You're then going to find your months of inventory over the course of 6 months, and then you're going to hit enter. And then from there, it's going to show you in 6 months' time, based on this trend, what it's going to look like. It's going to output what type of market. So is it going to be a buyer's market, a balanced market, or a seller's market? And then it will graph that over time as well for you. So the cool thing here is it doesn't necessarily matter if you are using a community, if you're using a product type in your city, if you're using your whole city, if you're using your whole state or province or your whole country, it can still work for that. But one limitation is if we have a very small sample size, if we're only looking at, say, 10 properties, then we can't really pull many trends from that. That's just too small of a sample size. So we do have to have a large enough sample size where we're not seeing these wild fluctuations in months of inventory because we're just not looking at that many homes. But if we have enough data points, regardless of the community, regardless of the city, regardless of the product type, this model should at least give us some understanding of which direction the market is going. Now, this can be extremely powerful when you're meeting with sellers and buyers. And the reason for that is we're always going to get this question, and especially we're getting it right now, is what's the market going to look like in 6 months' time? So again, we cannot say with 100% certainty. All we're using here is probabilities, and what we're using is just a very simple forecasting model, looking at historical trends, extrapolating that over time, and then seeing in 6 months' time with a reasonable degree of confidence where we're going to land. But as soon as we start to push beyond that 6 months, as you know, there's so many things that could happen that we can't really trust that trend to continue because we're only looking at historically 6 months, so we can't really trust beyond that. And that's a great communication tool for you when discussing with sellers and buyers too, is you can say, well, we can predict with some degree of confidence of what it's going to look like in 6 months' time. But beyond that, there's just too many variables at play. So feel free to use this tool, play around with it, and see if it's actually starting to showcase what it is that you anticipate the market's going to look like in 6 months' time. Thank you very much for watching or listening to this. Remember, you can reach out to me anytime on Instagram. I'm at the.michael.montgomery, or you can head over to revrealestateschool.com. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next lesson.